Catus Maximus here, this time with another camera teardown. I kind of like doing these. There was a big era of pocket cameras and modern cell phones, particularly in the last like 5 years. The cameras they're not as good as one of these, but their cameras have gotten so good that it's basically destroyed the pocket camera market. And people are just getting rid of them. These things are always like $5 or $10, sometimes more expensive. I don't get them when they're that expensive. I only get them when they're cheap, just for the puzzle of it, just for the teardown of it. This Panasonic isn't too bad. 7 megapixel, 10 times optical zoom. Lesia, or I don't know how to pronounce that lens name. Pretty big lens assembly in there. Couldn't get the battery to charge, but it does seem like a halfway decent quality camera, even though I haven't tested it. But as far as pocket cameras go, pretty nice screen, nice flush lens over it. Feels pretty good. Has an aluminum case. We can see a little bit of dings, but it's held up. Nice selection wheel there. And the weight. That thing weighs as much as this Kodak, whatever this is, Z1485 IS, and this Olympus X42. Both of these cameras are about the same mass as this Panasonic. So this was decent. Panasonic isn't the best, but they definitely seem to be trying. So anyway, we're just going to start pulling out screws here. We'll take our smallest little screwdriver. This thing has a ton of screws. 4 there, another one there. And it is a puzzle. A lot of these cameras I've had trouble taking apart because sometimes inside they have screws that are sideways or at all sorts of different angles. We have another 5 screws at the bottom. I find it interesting that it's an all metal case, but it uses plastic threads for the 1/4" 20 mount. It does use SD cards, but unfortunately it does use a proprietary rechargeable battery. I don't see any screws hiding in there, so we'll just start taking them out of here. Really do want some high quality screwdrivers when you're working with this kind of stuff, because these screws in these cameras are always super duper tiny. That's actually something you don't see very often. Blue Loctite on the screws. I do save these screws because not only for cameras, but there's all sorts of little devices that use all sorts of little screws like this, and if you lose one, it's like impossible to ever like order. It isn't impossible, but it's practically impossible to order just the right kind of special screw. That doesn't want to cooperate. And so if you have a little collection of these tiny screws, and if you have another camera or once again some other kind of piece of electronics that's missing a screw, you have a high likelihood of actually having a replacement unit on hand. There we go. We'll get the screw out of this side. And these cameras, as far as consumer electronics are concerned, for their size, they have just a ton of mechanics inside them. It's really kind of hard to compare what might have more mechanical complexity in such a small size for given the amount of money that they're charging for these things realistically. I mean, hard drives and stuff and various computer drives aren't this complicated for their size and cost. I mean, there's really nothing. Even cell phones, their camera systems have some mechanics, but not as many individually designed components as one of these cameras is. They're probably the camera is probably one of the most complicated devices for the dollar that's out there. I mean, if you even want to compare it to, say, printers or copying machines, a printer does have quite a bit of complexity in it as well, and so does a copying machine. Copying machines are also pretty amazing, but they're proportionally dollar for dollar per component basis. You don't get as much as you do out of one of these. So I think I got all of the screws out, and that does just want to peel up there. Did I forget something in the inside? Always annoy me, all these little proprietary ports. This port and the port on the Olympus, I believe, are the same cable. this Kodak here has a port that looks similar, but it doesn't actually physically take the same cable that the Panasonic does. Really super annoying the way they do that. There we go. There's our little ribbon cable, and we just have one of these flip up, two tiny little flip up connectors. Pop out the ribbon cable, and then there's our screen. How's our screen held in there? It appears to be held in just by some little clips. They're just little snaps. They're actually pretty good because they have little tabs that go inside little holes in this metal back case, which is of course hidden by the top cover of the camera. This is a plastic lens, but it's actually seems like it's hard coated, kind of like a Blu-ray disc. And then there's our little screen. Not a whole lot going on there. And of course the little buttons, and those are permanently attached. I guess this is kind of handy, these types of videos, for people who may need to take these apart for whatever reason. We do have a shield here. This is going to be, oh, that's pretty cool. That's a big copper shield to prevent interference, I guess, from the signals that are driving the screen from interfering with the rest of the camera. That's kind of a neat little object there. And then there's our button setup and our whole lens assembly. Like most of these cameras, they really can't. All the manufacturers are inside are kind of going to be similar to this because of the space constraints. It's all the choice you have. You have to have space for the battery, you have to have space for the whole lens assembly, and you have to have space for the motherboard. So that pretty much means, and oddly enough, and maybe it's because most people are right-handed, but most cameras are left-hand lens. We have another little flip tab here. Pull that ribbon cable loose, and oh, that's actually pretty neat. Some of these cameras are very difficult to pull apart, some are not too bad. There we go. That's a pretty so that's going to be really the brains of the operation. This is a neat setup because it's actually a double stacked motherboard with this really special high density connector that connects them both. And what we have here, it appears to be 3 memory chips, and there's going to be like a firmware chip, RAM. Actually, I don't know if it may be one of these smaller ones that's the firmware, but it's going to have one of these chips is going to be a RAM chip. One of these chips may be a short amount of onboard storage, and then we can see there that Panasonic is using apparently their own processor. And then down here we have another analog devices processor that may be dealing with what's coming right off the camera or right off the image sensor. It does some processing to it and then sends it off to the CPU for the actual camera. Get these ribbon cables out of here like so. We do have another one up here. Do have a couple of screws holding this little motherboard down. With a little metal clip. Oh, I see, that's a grounding clip for the body. We gotta discover where the other screws are. Always a puzzle to find all the little screws. Other than that, I only see 2. I don't know if there really is going to be more. I don't see a whole lot more. Always have to pause some. So the next piece of the puzzle is actually this top piece. It just slides out. That's pretty interesting. And so this is like the little illuminator for the anti-red eye. We have a couple more screws actually holding this circuit board to the top cover. Pull those out for the fun of it. Those are just such microscopic screws. Got another one over here. Screws so fine they just stick to your fingers. The red eye illuminator actually looks like we got a little plastic tab holding that in place. That is the speaker, because all of these can record video. Usually it's only 640 by 480. You really need a pretty modern camera. And that's kind of interesting. The red eye illuminator, which I guess is a send and receive, it has multiple things going on inside. There's actually in this cute little socket, which is kind of odd. There's actually quite a bit going on there because there's 8 pins on there, not just 2. Toss those electronics over there, and then not a whole lot else going on. This is a 2 pieces complicated mold. What is interesting is actually you can take it apart and then slide that off, and it's pretty easy to replace. This is the battery that maintains the memory, and on this Panasonic it had repairability in mind, because all you do is pull off the back cover, undo the ribbon cable, pull this out, and this little battery here is not even soldered like I think on every other camera. See if I can keep this in frame here. But this little battery, whoop, well, I just ruined it. Obviously you have to be pretty careful, but we can see you have to be really careful, much more careful than I was, because I would have just ruined this camera. This battery is just in a little plastic holder, and you can easily pop out the old one and put in a new one, which is pretty cool. Pretty rare to see that kind of repairability in a camera. We have the dial here for the switching the modes, and then this is going to be the dual pressures. You know, we have a little, I guess that's a mode switch. We have the toggle for the zoom right here, and then this is the 2-stage button, shutter button. All shutter buttons are 2-stage, so you press them partially and they focus, and you press them all the way and they actually take the shot. So now I'm going to take out some more screws. Show this part forward too. This is surprisingly repairable. Just pulling it all apart. 3 screws after you undo the 2 ribbon cables, and the whole LED, the entire LED sub-assembly just comes out all by itself. This camera is actually really easy to take apart. Now, the one thing I'll warn people, and I've shocked myself, is these photocell capacitors are like 300 volts, so you do want to watch out for that, because you can definitely get a pretty good zap out of them. We've got another little screw hiding right here. And there's so many little screws. They are just everywhere. Got a second one. Sometimes you can't even tell that there is a screw there until you really look, and you're like, wow, there's a microscopic screw. And I've said this before, the screws that are in cameras are the only thing that really gets smaller is like watch screws. Easiest way of putting it. So these are screws that are holding on this aluminum front frame. This seems like it was a bit back in when it was made. It was probably a bit more of an expensive camera, not just because of the repairability, but because it has a name brand lens, not a Panasonic, but the Lucia, you know, an aftermarket name brand lens. And since it's only 7 megapixels, I did see that having a 10 times zoom was probably a pretty big deal. Probably makes this camera 15 to 20 years old. And yeah, like this would have had to be, because this is just a whole separate machined aluminum part, machined, drilled, microscopic holes tapped. That's an expensive part for a little pocket camera. Let's see if we can't figure out why I can't get the rest of this apart. I'll get better at organizing these teardowns. After getting this last screw out, this little plate was hiding under a tab. You just push that tab aside or wedge it, and then this little interior metal bracket, whatever it is, comes apart. And so now the last piece of the puzzle is just trying to figure out how exactly this whole thing comes apart. And that's the complicated thing. And that wasn't too bad. It's just the way they have it set up, you kind of have to pull the board sideways in, lift it up so that these ports will clear their little bracket that they're in. And so there's the sub board with the memory card and everything, and then here's the main board. And what's interesting is there's actually little posts to help keep it all aligned. If I could actually align it. And then there's the, like they do in modern cell phones, they do the same thing where they have two boards that are layered on top of each other like that. And now we can actually see that there's one final screw hiding down in here, which is what keeps this whole assembly in there, and the little thumb thing, that's what keeps that on this aluminum front housing. Put that little screw aside, and then all we have here is just a battery holder. This just slips out of there like that. Oh, okay, you can get this bracket off if you really wanted to, I suppose. Not exactly sure how this is all held in there. There's probably just a couple little snaps or clippies, but that's the little battery assembly. And then here we have the flash, the eject spring for the battery terminals, the capacitor for the flash, and then the flash unit itself. And I guess we could try to tear down this little flash unit. We'll see how well I can actually do it. That this doesn't seem like it's really something that oh, I guess it disassembles. Interestingly enough, there's like this plastic tube which is around the flash capacitor. 300 volts, 88 microfarads, and it's a Rubicon. It's actually a name brand. And then there's a little bit of electronics for that board. This will be the last really wordy one. I'll be more of a speed runner, and I'm going to speed run through this. What I'm going to do is just take out all the screws that are visible, because it's usually the easiest way. What I should do is the easiest thing is actually removing the CCD sensor. I'll do that first. And then the thing about taking apart these lens assemblies, these are not meant to be serviced. You know, it's an assembly. If they do a warranty repair, they repair some of those modules. This is a module. The reason we know that is because these ribbon cables are laid down over the integrated various light sensors, terminals for the motor controls, position sensors, maybe controls for optical image stabilization, which is some electromagnets. All those ribbon cables are laid down and then soldered. So they would never sell an individual component. The only thing that's an exception would be the actual sensor itself, because there could be a problem with the sensor that's a warranty repair, but the entire rest of the lens assembly is just fine. So they usually make that its own separate part. And just like that, they did on its own little assembly. And there's our little 7 megapixel CCD array, and they're nope, not a whole lot else going on there. Always kind of amazing they can fit so many little millions of you know, sensors in a little artificial eyeball. Easiest way of putting that. We'll see how successful I am at tearing down this lens assembly. On some cameras you can tear them down to every last little part, down to the shutter. I mean, they were assembled, but sometimes they're just the way they do put them together. It's a puzzle that I couldn't figure out, or they kind of have certain ways that they snap together, like the telescoping portion, and there's just no way to actually fully tear them down. But this is where all the cool mechanics are, so that's why I do like getting into them. Pull out all these different little screws. More screws. It takes a pretty magical machine to make these tiny screws, I can tell you that too. See if there's any screws that are kind of hiding under the ribbon cable. Sometimes there is, sometimes there is not. Oh yeah, so here's our motors. They're just right here. One of these is going to be the autofocus motor to move a movable lens to do the focusing. The other one is the big motor, is the one that actually telescopes everything out and controls the zoom. Get that little screw out of there. This little screw out of there. Kind of like a Chris Ramsey video, only for pocket cameras. Chris Ramsey is like the biggest puzzle solving YouTuber, and so he has some pretty interesting videos about a bunch of crazy different puzzles. There we go. Now we're able to kind of disassemble all of this, and we can see a couple ribbon cables going in there, a couple of assemblies there, so I suspect this may have OIS. Yeah, see, this lens is moving up and down, where this lens here is run by this little motor here. This is what's controlling your focus. We'll go ahead and just shred those cables. This just comes apart. Super simple. These are always neat. I'll take this apart in a second. I'm going to see if I can't get this lens motor out of here. Oh, I see. It's partially held in by the ribbon cable itself. Which is actually in a recessed track here. It wasn't just partially, it was it's super delicate because I just ripped it right out of the side of this motor. Anyway, that is actually a little stepper motor, and as you can see, it's really finely threaded, and then this is the little wheel, so as the motor moves up and down, and precision steps, that's why it is a step motor, it adjusts the focus. Pretty cool. And then not a lot else. And then here's our little lens assembly. It has, or our focus assembly. It has a, one of the world's finest springs to maintain tension. And we have another little lens there. There's tons of stacked lenses in these. This I will give a special attention to because these are always neat, because this is the gearbox, and it takes from this motor and runs it all the way down to where it's turning this gear, but there often is many gears inside these. Sometimes 6 or 7 even. Pull out all its little screws. Actually, it looks like there's only 2 on this one. That was actually a pretty long screw. And then the ribbon cable is holding this together. What we can see here is there's actually 4 tabs on each side. There's only 2. It's just a regular DC motor, but there's going to be some sensors in there for it to, or a pulse encoder for it to be able to determine, you know, how far it's moving. Oh, and look at that. There was another little screw hiding under there. It was all screwed together, and then the cables were soldered on after the fact. Once again, this is not a part that you would ever be able to buy and service. So that's just a fork sensor. It's just a LED on one side and receiver on the other. That's why there's 4 wires. And this is detects when something is just indirectly interferes with it. I guess this comes apart this way. Now some of these I've taken apart and they've all been on metal posts. This is all on metal posts. So there's our big coarse gear. There's one of the reduction gears. Here's another reduction gear. Sorry. As they progressively get larger, this little reduction gear, that little reduction gear, and then there's our worm gear. And actually 4 metal posts, but the largest post, I guess just because of its size, is actually plastic. Kind of interesting that it's a hybrid, but tons of little gears inside there. Now as far as taking this apart the rest of the way, usually you have to extend the lens. We'll see how successful we are. So that motor just integrates with a little gear on the side there. Like so. And now the lens is extended. And you just actuate this gear, and so when it zooms, it's just twisting this thing out, and then it actually comes to a hard stop there. Pretty big lens. On big zoom they have to have bigger lens because of course you're taking the viewing area and crunching it down. Well, the first part is it actually just pushes out, and so here's the outer housing with all these chamfers, which is kind of like the threaded portion, which is holding this part. I'm trying to figure out, here we go. So this part is actually being held stationary, so when it goes out, this collar is basically what's twisting, and so that's what unfolds and does the zoom. So it'll unfold, and then there's the zoom. It needs a whole bunch of throw. That's pretty surprising, all that fits inside there. Now this is, I may not quite be able to get it much further apart. Highlight, when you retract it all the way, then this center section, these little side pins will line up to the outside collar, and then there's this little slot. So when this is turning, it's just, so you have free wheels there. And we have the next stage of the lens. And that's how the shutter opens and closes. It just gets to the very end. And then this, surprisingly enough, has 6 pegs. And there's press fit. Each one of those is metal. They're made on like a tiny little Swiss screw machine. And then this is going to be the primary lens portion. And it just pops out just like that. And then that piece pops out. As soon as you kind of figure it out, this Panasonic, and then we do have another little collar in here. This portion is snapped together. Two little tabs there. Surprisingly serviceable. There's our floating lens assembly. And so this is actually going to be our shutter. I do not believe this has an iris. And we're going to have a optical image stabilization in there as well. We pull out these ribbon cables, we'll have 2 of them. Get rid of those screws. Even more screws. These are the tiniest ones yet. I mean, when you talk about a tiny screw, that is a tiny screw. You really need a pretty decent little screwdriver. Oh, I see, that one screw is what held the OIS to the shutter assembly. They're stacked on top of each other, so there's our shutter assembly. Normally open because it's a digital camera, not like a film camera. I guess I gotta open up, so it'll just snapshot. It's using the whatever these are, super black little, you know, flexible carbon things, and there'll just be like a solenoid, a little electromagnet that just pulses on and snaps them shut super fast. And we can see there's 2 of them because there's 2 sets of wires, one on the left, one on the right. Don't want to lose these screws. If you lose them, actually in carpet it's not so bad because they'll either vacuum out, they're nothing more than just like another particle. But if they're like, if you're barefoot and they're on a hardwood floor, you'll know it. It will hurt. Got those screws out, but not sure if I'm going to be able to remove the rest of this assembly here. There's our little coils for the little electromagnets that drive. There we go. Oh, that's interesting. So it's all integrated. The little electromagnet is a solenoid, and when it activates, it actually pulls this lever. Kind of like a motor, but that only turns for just a small amount. Come on, get off my finger. And when it turns, I'm trying to see where it was grabbing onto, but it grabs onto some portion in here and activates the actual shutter. And to finish this long droning video off, here's our OIS system. You have up and down and side to side. Not a lot else in there, and it's just 2 electromagnets that are constantly running. There's going to be an accelerometer, and so when you're when you're shaking around, that's all it's doing. Is it's just same thing in the current smartphones. It's not much motion there, but as you shake around, it just moves it up and down and side to side to try to reduce the shake dynamically through more complicated electromagnets. Anyway, I'll do better, try to be a little bit more expedient in my next camera teardown. I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.